Imagine waking up one morning and seeing 80,000 soldiers on your doorstep. Not for gold, not for land, but for sugar. February 14, 1630. 60 warships appear off the coast of Brazil. Orange and white flags. Dutch flags. And they're not here to trade. They're here to conquer. For 24 years, a piece of South America became Europe. A forgotten empire built on white gold. An invasion most history books never mention. This is the story of when the Netherlands invaded Brazil and almost changed the world forever. There's a story that history forgot. A tale of invasion, sugar, an empire that unfolded on the tropical shores of Brazil for centuries ago. It's a story about what happens when resources become more valuable than gold itself, when merchants transform into warriors, and when an entire continent becomes a chessboard for European powers playing a game of economic domination. On a warm February morning in 1630, the people of Pernambuco, Brazil, saw something on the horizon that would change their lives forever. 60 warships. 80,000 warriors. Orange and white flags snapping in the Atlantic wind. The Dutch had arrived, and they hadn't come for a visit. They had come for something the world was willing to kill for. Something they called white gold. Sugar. This is the story of how the Netherlands, a nation thousands of miles away across the ocean, invaded Brazil and held it for nearly a quarter century. It's a story most people have never heard, buried beneath more famous colonial tales. But it's a story that shaped the modern world in ways we still feel today. Because this wasn't just about territory. It wasn't just about flags and armies. This was about control. Control over the most profitable substance on Earth at that time, second only to silver. And the empires of Europe would do anything to possess it. Let's go back to that February day in 1630. Imagine standing on the coast of Pernambuco, looking out at the ocean. The morning sun glints off the water. And then you see them. Ship after ship after ship, stretching across the horizon like a floating city. The Dutch fleet had arrived with overwhelming force, and the Portuguese defenders of this Brazilian territory knew immediately they were in trouble. Pernambuco wasn't just any region. During the 17th century, it was one of the most economically powerful places on the planet. Why? Because of sugar. The sweet, crystalline substance that Europeans had become obsessed with. Sugar was transforming European diets, European economies, and European ambitions. And Pernambuco was the world's largest producer of it. Jorge Cabral, a professor of Brazilian colonial history, describes those early years as difficult beyond measure. For 4 years, the defenders tried to hold out against the siege. But gradually, inexorably, the Dutch expanded their control. They captured Olinda, the regional capital. They seized Recife, the crucial port through which all that precious sugar flowed to European markets. And they held on. For 24 years, this became Dutch territory in South America. Their longest reign in the New World. But why did they come at all? What made the Netherlands, a relatively small nation in Northern Europe, launch such a massive invasion across the Atlantic Ocean? To understand that, we need to understand what sugar meant in the 17th century. Sugar wasn't just a sweetener. It was wealth crystallized. It was power you could touch and taste. British colonialists called it white gold, and they meant it literally. The profit margins on sugar were staggering. Growing it, processing it, refining it, shipping it to Europe where demand seemed endless. Whoever controlled the sugar trade controlled immense wealth. And with that wealth came the ability to fund armies, build fleets, and expand empires even further. For sugar to flow, something else had to flow too. Human lives. millions of enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas specifically for sugar production. The sugar economy wasn't just built on enslaved labor. It was inseparable from it. Every spoonful of sugar that sweetened European coffee or tea carried with it the weight of human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. This is the dark heart of the white gold story. A story of exploitation built upon exploitation, where the pursuit of profit justified any atrocity. The Dutch invasion of Pernambuco wasn't their first attempt at seizing Brazilian territory. Between 1624 and 1625, Dutch forces had captured Salvador in Bahia. But they were expelled within a year. That failure didn't discourage them. It taught them. When they returned to Brazil in 1630, they came with more ships, more soldiers, and a better strategy. They had learned from their mistakes, and now they were ready to stay. But this conflict had deeper roots. To understand why the Dutch invaded Brazil, we have to travel back in time to 1580 and look at what happened in Portugal. That year, Portugal found itself without a successor to the throne. A power vacuum. King Philip II of Spain, seeing an opportunity, claimed the Portuguese crown and became Philip I of Portugal. Suddenly, two major colonial empires were united under one monarch. For years before this, the Dutch and Portuguese had been partners in the sugar trade. The Dutch provided transportation, financing, and refining services in Europe. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Dutch merchants grew wealthy from Portuguese sugar, and those profits did something the Spanish crown didn't like at all. They helped fund the Dutch war for independence from Spain. Think about the irony. Spanish-controlled Portuguese colonies were producing sugar that was making Dutch merchants rich, and those Dutch merchants were using that money to fight against Spanish rule. Philip IV recognized this problem. In 1621, he made a decision that would change everything. He banned all trade between Brazil and the Dutch colonies. Dutch ships were forbidden from Portuguese ports. The profitable partnership was over. Bruno Ferreira Miranda, a historian at the Federal University of Pernambuco, explains it clearly. The Spanish Empire imposed sanctions, cutting off Dutch access not just to sugar but to all the valuable goods flowing from Brazil. Tobacco, spices, Brazil wood, and the enslaved people who made the whole system function through the horrific slave trade. The Dutch response was aggressive and calculated. If they couldn't trade for sugar, they would take the land that produced it. The decision to attack Pernambuco was part of a larger strategy. The Dutch West India Company, formed to finance colonial ventures, wanted to seize Spain's American colonies. They saw weakness in the Spanish defenses. They saw opportunity. Pernambuco was just the beginning. After establishing themselves there, they looked toward Peru, Mexico, the Caribbean. They wanted it all. But conquest is never as clean or easy as it appears on maps. Professor Cabral points out that the Dutch period in Brazil, especially those first 7 years from 1630 to 1637, was marked by constant warfare, hunger, and violence. The Dutch may have talked about this period in glamorous terms later, but the reality was brutal. Dutch soldiers were constantly hungry. Disease ravaged their ranks. Smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery. They died in numbers that shocked their commanders. Ferreira Miranda notes that illness was one of the greatest enemies the West India Company's army faced. More deadly than Portuguese resistance in many ways. The tropical climate, so different from the Netherlands, became a weapon the invaders couldn't defend against. Yet they persisted. And between 1637 and 1644, something unexpected happened. A period of relative peace. During these years, a German nobleman named Johan Maurits van Nassau arrived to govern what the Dutch called New Holland. Nassau was different from most colonial administrators. He wasn't just interested in extracting wealth. He wanted to build something. Nassau transformed Recife into a genuinely cosmopolitan city. He commissioned architectural masterpieces. He built 2 grand palaces, one with a minaret 60 meters high, reaching toward the tropical sky. He brought artists and scientists. He allowed religious freedom in ways that were radical for the time. Catholics could practice their faith again. Jewish people could worship openly in public synagogues. This was remarkable in an era of religious persecution and rigid orthodoxy. Professor Cabral notes that even today, if you ask people in Recife about their city's history, many will tell you Nassau was the best mayor they ever had. Centuries later, his legacy endures. The fact that a colonial occupier is remembered fondly tells you something about how different he was from what came before and after. But Nassau's enlightened rule couldn't save the Dutch colony. The end began not in Brazil but thousands of miles away in Amsterdam. The sugar markets there became flooded. Too much supply. Falling prices. Sugar traders who had been wealthy were suddenly going bankrupt. The bottom was falling out of the market that had justified the entire colonial venture. The Dutch West India Company and merchants in Amsterdam began demanding immediate debt repayment from Brazilian sugar mill owners. Not gradual payments. Not installments. Everything. Now. José Manuel Santos Pérez, director of the Center for Brazilian Studies at the University of Salamanca, describes the pressure building like a storm about to break. Mill owners who owed money to the Dutch company faced a stark choice. Throw out the Dutch or go bankrupt themselves. The rebellion began in 1645. Portuguese colonists and local people in Pernambuco rose up against Dutch rule. The Dutch, weakened by economic troubles at home and without the resources to negotiate debt relief, found themselves trapped. High taxes imposed by the West India Company had made them deeply unpopular. Now that unpopularity turned violent. Santos Pérez describes how the Dutch in the cities were harassed to the point where they practically stopped leaving their homes. Anyone who ventured out risked attack by Portuguese forces. The siege had reversed. Now the Dutch were the ones trapped, holding on to coastal cities while hostile forces surrounded them. The Dutch forces in Brazil no longer had the combat capability to counter local resistance. Their supplies were limited. Reinforcements from the Netherlands were uncertain. The colony that had cost so much to establish, that had been held for nearly a quarter century, was slipping away. By 1654, it was over. The Dutch withdrew from Brazil. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. When the Dutch lost Brazil, they didn't give up on American sugar production. They simply moved. They conquered other parts of South America along the Caribbean coast. Suriname. Essequibo. These territories might not have been as glamorous as Pernambuco, but they had advantages. Good climate for sugar. Easy access by boat. Trade winds for sailing. Fertile soil. Cabral and Santos Pérez write in their book about this transition. The Dutch picked up their ships, set sail, and sought out new unexploited areas. The loss of Brazil wasn't the end of Dutch colonial ambitions. It was a redirection. Sugar production simply moved to different locations under Dutch control. What does this forgotten chapter of history teach us? It shows us how economic interests drive empires. How the desire for control over profitable resources can justify invasions across oceans. How human suffering, in the form of slavery, was treated as just another input in the production process. Millions of lives reduced to economic calculations. It also shows us how precarious colonial control could be. The Dutch held Pernambuco for 24 years with massive investment of ships, soldiers, and money. And yet, when the economic justification collapsed, when the sugar markets turned against them, the entire enterprise became unsustainable. Empires built on extraction and exploitation contain the seeds of their own failure. The story of Dutch Brazil is a story about white gold. But it's really about what people will do for wealth. What they'll justify. Who they'll hurt. How far they'll travel and what they'll destroy to control something as simple as crystallized plant juice that makes food taste sweet. Today, Recife stands as a vibrant Brazilian city. The palaces Nassau built are long gone. The Dutch flags no longer fly. But the legacy of this period remains. In the architecture. In the cultural mix. In the historical memory of a time when this corner of Brazil was briefly part of a European empire's American dreams. And sugar? It's everywhere now. Cheap, abundant, taken for granted. It's hard to imagine that for centuries ago, it was precious enough to justify invasions, to fund armies, to reshape entire continents. The white gold that once drove empires to war across oceans is now in every kitchen cabinet, every soda, every candy bar. But maybe the next time you sweeten your coffee, you'll think about those 60 ships on the horizon. About the people who saw them coming and knew their world was about to change. About the enslaved people who suffered to produce the substance that made it all profitable. About the forgotten empire in the tropics that flourished briefly and then disappeared, leaving behind only stories.